Okay. All right. So we are recorded. Okay. So just two things just to introduce the series. We've got a full lineup now. Besides Rabbi Barry today, Rabbi Steve is speaking next week. And then he'll be followed by Rabbi Ban from Suburban Temple. And then Simcha Zevet, who many of you might know, was in town and had a renewal congregation here. She currently leads a renewal congregation in Philadelphia. And then we're going to wrap up the program with Professor Alana Cooper, whose degree is in Jewish studies, and she is Orthodox, and she'll be talking about Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy. But tonight, we have Rabbi Barry Starr, who's a conservative rabbi, retired, mostly retired. And Rabbi Starr went to the Jewish seminary in New York, graduated in 1972, and has served congregations in Minneapolis, Binghamton, New York, and finally a long-standing association with a congregation in Sharon, Massachusetts. And on a personal note, we've been friends since kindergarten and managed to maintain that friendship all that time. And it's as close as it ever has been. So Barry has been not just a friend, but he's pretty much family. Just to give you an idea, I remember on the high holidays, Barry would go to Park and we went to Heights Temple. And after services were over, he'd come over and sometimes other people would come over and we talk about the sermons and what we heard and discussed. So it's been a long-standing, valuable friendship. And so without going further, Rabbi Starr.
Thanks. It's nice to meet all of you. I hope someday I'll have the opportunity to meet you in person, not just online. I virtually grew up in Alan's house. His parents, may they rest in peace, were great friends of my parents. May they rest in peace. And we just have a long-standing relationship. And when he asked me to do this program, I was more than happy. In fact, just a quick disclaimer, ideally, conservative Judaism would be the third, and I'll explain that why in a moment, would be the third session. It would be Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Renewal. That would be the order if we were doing this historically. Don't blame Alan, I wasn't available besides this week and next, so he had no choice if he wanted me to participate. So it's not his fault. Another quick disclaimer. In the course of what I'm going to say, I will reference some of the other movements that's necessary for historical context. I will do my best to be objective and non-biased. However, if what I say offends anyone, I apologize in advance. It is not my attempt here to evaluate the movements or make a judgment. I'm going to try to be as historically authentic as possible. But beforehand, I want you to know if something I say strikes you as not representative of the particular movement that I'm talking about, I certainly understand that it is not intentional. All right? With all those disclaimers in mind, let's go. Movements in both Judaism and probably other religions and politics as well, movements are by nature reactive. Nobody wakes up in the morning, nudges their partner and say, Sophie, we're going to start a movement today. It just doesn't happen that way. Movements are a reaction to something going on around in the world. Judaism has always had movements. The period of perhaps the most famous period of movements was the millennium, around the time of Jesus. Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Essenes, you name it, we had a million movements. And throughout history, we have had movements. The modern movements in Judaism are a reaction as well. And they are a reaction, in my opinion, to enlightenment and emancipation. Now, enlightenment and emancipation are actually two different things that are connected. Enlightenment is an intellectual exercise. Enlightenment is the world changing and becoming more aware of science, reality, criticism, critical theory. Happened in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And Enlightenment sparked a number of intellectual reactions to the world. Emancipation was a political and sociological movement, idea rather, that impacted how the Jew lived in the world and how he reacted to the world in which he lived. Emancipation as an idea suggested that Jews could be part of the world. They need not separate themselves. They need not be wholly and totally different from the rest of the world. And if we did that, we could be accepted within the larger society as one group amongst many. That's a very quick analysis. We don't have time for me to go into it in greater detail. If you have questions later, maybe I can deal with it. But all of the movements in modern Judaism, one way or another, are a response to enlightenment and emancipation. The first response was Reform Judaism. By the way, not reformed, they're not former criminals. Reform Judaism means let's change our mode of behavior so that emancipation can go ahead, move ahead, and so that we as Jews can begin to look like, feel like, and be accepted as part of the Western world. Okay? And Reform Judaism was an attempt to restructure Jewish life in certain minor ways, some not so minor, to respond, to say we embrace emancipation, we embrace enlightenment, we embrace the idea that Judaism can change and evolve, and we as Reform Jews are going to do something different from what Jews have done for the past 1,000 years. There was no orthodoxy, there was just Judaism. Judaism was what it was. If you chose to accept the mitzvot and do them, that was fine. If you didn't, that was your choice. The community may exert pressure, but it was your choice of how you reacted to your Jewish tradition. There was no movement. The movement of orthodoxy began as a response to reform. Was there a need for a movement? And again, I don't want to get into, that's not my purpose here to talk about orthodoxy, but there was a need to structure a response to this idea that Jews should reform what they do to embrace enlightenment and emancipation. Orthodoxy was a response to that as a movement with schools and with institutions. Movements educate, movements have institutions. That was the response of Orthodoxy. And all of that took place in Western Europe. All of that took place in Western Europe. Now, to go back for a moment, the idea of enlightenment stirred within the minds of scholars, rabbis, and teachers the idea that maybe Judaism ought to be viewed, and Judaism and its texts ought to be viewed in the same way that we critically view other texts, Shakespeare, Homer, any literary text, that we ought to look at it in a much more enlightened way. This intellectual idea that Judaism, we need to look at Judaism in its historic context. Everything comes through history, through contextually understanding what Judaism is about. That the changes that evolved in early rabbinic Judaism were a response to the moment, and that those responses needed to be viewed historically, critically. This idea, which is known in the Jewish world as historical positive Judaism. Remember that historical positive Judaism was a powerful idea amongst elite scholars, rabbis, and teachers in Western and somewhat Eastern Europe as well. But that's an idea, and people do not live based on ideas alone. So those scholars found a home either in Orthodoxy and said to themselves, well, you know, my thought process, my intellectual stimulation, my intellectual ideas are different from the people that I'm praying with, but you know what? It's okay, I can live with that. And they did live with it. Or they found a home within Reform and said, well, you know, Reform Jews generally embrace enlightenment. And okay, so they've made some changes. I can live with that. And they did. So historical positive Judaism as an idea motivated a whole range of scholars and rabbis, but there was no need for a movement. It was an idea that had merit, but didn't require anyone to react with a movement. They found their home wherever they felt comfortable, in Orthodoxy or within Reform. Now, that idea of historical positive Judaism carried over to the New World, meaning us, America, through its scholars and teachers. And some of them sort of brought to America the intellectual idea of historical positive Judaism. And in doing so, they founded an institution called the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which taught those intellectual ideas. Again, no movement yet, a school teaching ideas. I can tell you that the people who taught in that school were traditional Jews. Many of them prayed in Orthodox synagogues. But intellectually, they were not there with orthodoxy. Now, to step back for a moment, what does that mean? What's the difference between historical positive Judaism and the traditional Judaism that existed within the world and then within the Orthodox world? Without getting too detailed, I think I can explain it in this way. The traditional Jewish world, when they taught commentaries on the Bible, and they came to Rashi, one of the great commentators on the Bible, and they taught it, they exclaimed, Rashi says. What does Rashi say, right? In the present tense, as if Rashi is sitting in front of you, giving his comments and his ideas verbally to the student. Historical positive Judaism framed it this way. What did Rashi say? Not what does he say, but what did he say? What's the difference? It's a recognition that Judaism must be seen within a historical context. The commentaries, the laws, the changes that rabbis have made over the centuries, while they may have been well intentioned, are a product of the society and the times in which people lived. And said historical positive Jews, you have to understand that. You have to understand that. It is all in historical context. But you and I know, as I'm talking to you, that may be a nice idea. I think almost all of us embrace that idea, but it doesn't create a movement, and it doesn't create a community of worshipers and learners, right, who are committed to a vague idea that we call historical positive Judaism. So what turned that idea into the conservative movement? Two things happened. First, Eastern European Jews, hundreds of thousands, came to these shores from Europe. Now, the people who came here were not necessarily the most religious Jews, though many of them were religious. The joke is, and it's probably not a joke, that if you're looking for a set of tefillin, the best place to find it is at the bottom of the East River. As the boats came into New York, many Jews, and I happen to know this for a fact because several of them were members of my congregation, took their tefillin, which are the prayer boxes, and threw them overboard when they arrived and saw the the Statue of Liberty. They weren't rejecting being Jewish. They were rejecting the Judaism that came with Eastern Europe. What they felt was stultified, unimaginative Judaism that their parents and grandparents in Eastern Europe had foisted upon them in traditional Orthodox circles. But where were they going to go? The alternative was Reform Judaism. And in the late 19th century, Reform Judaism, though it was moving in this direction, took a turn that many of these Jews could not handle. You will learn when you learn about Reform, about the Great Treifa Banquet, right? It isn't that it was treif that was the problem. I mean, it was classic. It was kind of over the top treif. But the important piece of that is that for East European Jews, that was a step too far, right? many of them, while they themselves were not going to be Orthodox Jews, were not going to be traditional and wanted to fit into America, right? But for them to go to a place where shrimp was served, that was just a step too far. So what happened was, in response to this move of reform to the left, if you will, not politically so much, but religiously, and the inability to maintain connections to orthodoxy, in America, a new movement emerged. That was conservative Judaism. It is a uniquely American response. It did not exist in Europe. And why is that? Conservative Judaism is a centrist movement. It's a movement that tries to somehow grab two polarities, hold on to both polarities at the same time, and merge them together. The classic book on conservative Judaism, written by Mordechai Waxman in the 1940s or 50s, I'm not sure exactly when he wrote it, is called Tradition and Change. Those are the polarities. We live in a world, how do we grab onto tradition on the one hand and change on the other hand? They saw the world that reform was all about change and less about tradition. I'm not arguing that they were right or wrong. That's the way they saw it. They saw orthodoxy as all about tradition and not about change. Again, I'm not evaluating whether that was correct or not. The American response then is to take a middle of the road. Let's combine tradition on the one hand, a healthy respect for tradition, with a healthy respect for change. And that was perceived as an idea that American Jews could respond to. Because these East European Jews didn't want to give up all sense of tradition, but neither did they want a world that had completely abandoned, and again, in their perception, that had abandoned Judaism in favor of American participation. And so they tried to hold on to these two polarities at the same time. By the way, very difficult. From the start, it was not easy, and I'll explain as I go along what the problems were. But understand that in America, in the earliest years of this, well, of the last millennium, the 1900s, centrism was a good thing, right? Now, by the way, being in the center is not a good thing. It is considered to be wishy-washy. That's not a technical term, but it's considered to be, how can you hold on to polarities? You got to go one way or the other. That's sort of the way American society is structured, as I see it now, so that centrism in politics or religion is frowned upon as being inconclusive, unauthentic. For the early conservative Jews, this was viewed as the most authentic view of Judaism, because in their minds, all throughout history, Jews have been balancing tradition and change. And we are no different today, except the world is different. But in their minds, they saw Judaism as being a history of tradition and change and a balancing of those two polarities. Now, the early conservative Jews, like all movements, posited the following question. If Rabbi Akiba came back today, which movement would he belong to? Right? By the way, I suspect if Rabbi Akiba came back today, he wouldn't be in any of the movements, but that's a different story. But each movement tried to argue, oh, no. We are the authentic rabbinic Jews. We are authentic. In the 1960s, I believe, a Reform scholar, and I can't for the life of me remember who it was, wrote a book called Heirs to the Pharisees, the Reform movement, who believed that they were the legitimate continuation of Pharisaic Judaism. Orthodoxy thought the same way. Conservative Jews thought the same way. Everybody thinks that they are the real authentic Judaism, and between you and me, it's really hard to figure out. But I will tell you a little legend in Jewish tradition which suggests to me that ancient rabbis felt the same, had the same problem. So there is a midrash, a legend told that Moses is transported, beamed up from his time to sit in the academy of Rabbi Akiba. Because Moses says to God, look, you know, what's going to happen after I die? What's Judaism going to be like? Show me. So God transports Moses thousands of years ahead, well, 1,000 years ahead, to the academy of Rabbi Akiba. And Rabbi Akiba is talking about all kinds of things that Moses has no clue about, doesn't understand a word of it. And he looks to God and says, what is this? Is this Judaism? I don't understand any of it. And one of the students says to Rabbi Akiba, how do you know all this stuff? And Akiba says, because it comes from Moses at Sinai. And Moses says to God, oh, thank God. Okay, now I'm all right. I get it. Now, obviously it's a story. We know that. But the rabbi who invented that story, who made that story real, must have felt the same way. My God, if Moses comes back today, he's not going to understand any of this. And the answer is, that's right. Because Judaism changes and evolves over time. And we would not expect Rabbi Akiba to come today and sit in any of our synagogues and feel either comfortable or know basically what's going on. It just wouldn't be reasonable to assume that. But all the movements, one way or another, thought that they represented the real, authentic Jewish way of doing things. And so if you asked me what's authentic Judaism, I would say it is the balancing of tradition and change, which is, by the way, not easy and has its pitfalls, as I'll point out, but that balance represents conservative Judaism in its theoretical best. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, Rabbi, doesn't this, what you've just said, would argue that conservative Judaism had built into it its own demise? Because when those East European Jews who had a history of tradition, right, when second, third, and fourth generations came along who did not have that commitment to Jewish tradition, what's the point of having a conservative movement, right? I shouldn't say what's the point. Where are the Jews? They're all going to be somewhere else. And they're not going to be in conservative movement because this idea of tradition and change, which was maybe is a great idea if you don't really care as much about tradition. So I'll opt for the change side. I don't need to have the tradition side as much in my constellation of ideas. And by the way, if you were thinking that, you would be exactly right. And we are watching the demise of the conservative movement as I speak. In numbers, in synagogues, in commitment, etc. Right? We're watching it. Won't happen in my lifetime, but it will happen soon. But please, the idea of historical positive Judaism and the balancing of tradition and change as an idea will not die. The problem is that's not enough to motivate a movement. It just isn't. And so our synagogues are uncreative. They are unable to inspire the younger generation, not because the idea, most of the younger generation would buy the idea if it's explained to them properly. But what the conservative movement hasn't offered is a spiritual experience to go along with it. By the way, if you ask me, Rabbi, so what's your spiritual experience? I will just tell you, for me, studying Judaism is a spiritual experience, but I don't expect that to be the same for everybody. That's not where everyone's at. I understand that. But for me, I don't need to have prayer as my spiritual experience, although I do pray all the time. My spiritual life is bound up with this idea of critical historical thinking and studying and learning and growing. Okay? Now, how did this tradition and change thing really operate? And here's the problem. And again, I think you understand the slippery slope idea. Once, and this is what Orthodoxy said all along, and they were right in this sense, that once you start tinkering with tradition, it'll never end until you do away with tradition altogether. So that has turned out to be prescient, but the leaders of the conservative movement would argue that we're not doing away with tradition, we're modifying it to fit the needs of modern American life. So, for example, let's take the issue of driving to the synagogue on Shabbat. By the way, just a side note here, much of what I'm talking about is the product of rabbinic, not biblical Judaism. That is to say, it's we, all the movements and all of Judaism throughout history since maybe the 4th century before the Common Era, have been guided by rabbinic changes and rabbinic interpretations of Judaism. We know that. And historical positive Judaism would say, we understand those changes, but they were a product of the times and the biases of those who made the changes. We don't necessarily need to live by those changes in 2022. So just briefly, if the attitude toward women 2,000 years ago has changed over time, then the role of women within Jewish life needs to change appropriately. That doesn't mean that the rabbis in the past were evil human beings. They lived at a time when women were viewed in a particular way. But that doesn't mean that we in the modern world need to view Judaism and the approach to women in the same way that rabbis 2,000 years ago may have viewed the issue. And that many of the changes that the conservative movement made, by the way, slowly, change, tradition and change means that you change slowly because tradition is always pulling you back from many changes, or at least making it need to be more thoughtful about it. Perhaps thoughtful is a positive way of putting it, but the idea of conservative Judaism is to conserve tradition as much as possible. Let me go back to another example. Early on, the conservative movement made a ruling that you could drive to the synagogue on Shabbat. Orthodoxy believed that driving, which involves turning on a car and lighting a fire because the spark of the spark plugs, when you put the key in, that's like lighting a fire. It's a no-no. Can't do that and be part of the traditional community. Reform Judaism had said all along, we're not into the issue of lighting fire and not lighting fire, so driving or not driving is your choice. The conservative movement said, well, we understand that tradition requires that we not light fires and that we not drive. However, how are we going to get to the synagogue? And we want you in the synagogue. So in the balance of tradition and change, the ruling was you can drive the car to the synagogue, but nowhere else. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, that is probably the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, you're right. Well, not dumb, but you're right that it is totally, as one of my professors said, well, when you go out to start the car, lift up the hood and tell the engine, I'm only going to the synagogue, right? I mean, it makes no sense. If you're going to drive, you drive. If you're not going to, and that's exactly what happened. It's a nice idea that you'll only drive to the synagogue, but in reality, once you're in the car, you're going to drive, right? I'll go visit my sick aunt. That's a wonderful thing to do. That's a great mitzvah to visit your sick aunt. Okay, well, how about if I go to the mall and buy her flowers and then visit my sick aunt? Oh, well, that's a wonderful thing to do. Well, while I'm buying flowers, I have to stop at the store and get cheese for my blintzes tonight. Well, where does it stop? And I'm trying to place this in a context, not to make fun of it, but that the inconsistency often in trying to balance tradition and change leads to some interesting intellectual gymnastics. Now, for the Jews who lived and came from Eastern Europe, that was a great thing. Oh, I can drive to the synagogue and still be a traditional Jew. And they loved it. And conservative synagogues flourished in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Thousands of synagogues, well, hundreds of synagogues, Jews all over the place, the largest movement, et cetera, et cetera. But go forward 2 or 3 generations, and where there's no commitment to that old time tradition that motivated their great grandparents, the generations are saying, wait a minute, if I can drive to the synagogue, then there's no tradition in that. So either I can be a Reformed Jew and make my own decisions about what I do without having to worry about what tradition says, or I can be an Orthodox Jew and live according to Orthodox Judaism and either not drive to the synagogue or drive and park 3 blocks away and walk and put water on my head, pretending that I sweated walking all the way from wherever it was that I walked, right? And I'm being facetious, but the fact is that conservative Judaism had within it the seeds of what I would call its own demise as a movement, not as an idea. The idea that Judaism represents an amalgam of tradition and change is, in my view, a very positive idea. It is a very motivating, but it's an idea. It doesn't translate necessarily into a movement that can sustain itself over time. If you're going to ask me, well, then what's going to happen to the conservative movement in the next 50 years? I will tell you what I think, but I'm not Nostradamus, so I don't honestly know. But I think that there will be small pockets of people who embrace the idea of historical Judaism, who can handle the intellectual challenge of balancing tradition and change. And those small pockets will exist as, I suppose I could call them chavurot, small groups of people who get together for study and for prayer, right? No big synagogues, no big movement, none of the things that generally go with this, but that the idea that the conservative movement had, namely that we need to look at Judaism from an honest historical perspective, that will continue. One other, I know I've taken a lot of time and there may be 1,000 questions, and I do want to leave time to answer them or at least listen to them. But one more thought. Conservative Judaism is not just about law, it's also about theology. And over time, originally, historical positive Judaism left the Bible alone. It did not, in the Jewish world, that idea did not extend back to the Bible. The Bible was, for most of those scholars, still the Word of God. And so we don't touch that. So for them, they observed Shabbat, right? They observed Shabbat in their own way, whatever way they felt was necessary, because the rabbinic way of observing Shabbat was a product of rabbinic times, life, the era in which they lived, the technology that they had, et cetera, right? So these early scholars observed Shabbat. They did not touch the biblical corpus. Their critical theory started with, or generally started with, rabbinic Judaism, post-biblical Judaism, or post-5 books of Moses Judaism. Over time, the conservative movement's theological ideas changed, and so the Bible also was subjected to this same critical understanding. That did not happen initially, it happened over time. And for your sake, that is, you as a Reconstructionist synagogue, as you will or have already learned, Mordechai Kaplan was the conservative Jewish thinker who moved that process along to in a speedy way to reach where you are today as Reconstructionist Jews. Mordechai Kaplan was a conservative Jew. He taught at the seminary. He put on tefillin and observed Shabbat and kashrut, right? But he had a very different understanding of Judaism and of God, as you obviously know. That change in theology came over a long period of time, as rabbis and scholars began to say, look, if we're going to subject the rabbinic tradition to historical understanding, if we're going to subject rabbis, the rabbinic views, to history, science, archaeology, sociology, psychology, etc., why can't we, we must do the same with the Bible itself. And so the conservative movement in its present form consists of a lot of people who would argue against the fact that the Bible is the Word of God, even though initially conservative Jews bought into that idea. Today, not so much. And of course, as we see, Mordechai Kaplan's ideas spawned a new movement that went even further in its understanding of both the theology and the idea of where tradition fits into all of these patterns. And again, that's not for me to talk about, not about conservative Judaism. So, bottom line, to sort of put a cap on this, conservative Judaism is born out of an idea. The idea becomes a movement in America because of the unique demographic and sociological situation of American Jewry. It flourished in America in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 80s. It flourished because it combined those elements of tradition and change, which at the time made sense to the generations that were not as far removed from the great-grandparents who came to America, but as from the 80s and beyond, the younger generation began to see the weakness in this idea of trying to hold on to tradition and change at the same time. They saw its inconsistencies, they saw some of its weakness, without necessarily abandoning the idea that spawned it, that was the foundation of conservative Judaism. They also found that conservative Judaism, while it reflected a nice idea, was also not meeting the spiritual needs of the newer generations. And so other movements came about, and many of the young people moved off and moved away to other movements and other forms of Jewish expression. So that's where we're at today. I still believe wholeheartedly in the idea. And I will tell you, I daven, just for the sake of you knowing, I'm at Bethel of the Heights, which is just what I described, a small group of people who understand the intellectual point of Jewish life, but who want also to hold on to traditional values and understandings, and in their lives have learned and are learning and growing in trying to balance these tradition and change. But it is a small group. And I've talked to a lot of people about joining us, and they say, well, you know, it's not for me. And that's fine, I understand that. But that, I believe, may be the future of conservative. And by the way, Bethel is not a conservative synagogue. It's an independent, unaffiliated synagogue. But to me, it behaves exactly like a conservative synagogue ought to behave. But if the conservative synagogues of Cleveland were like that, Park Synagogue, instead of having 1,400 families, would have 80 families. Probably would not need the big building that it has. I say that with some facetiousness, right? Is it bad that there'd be 70 families? No. But it wouldn't be able to support a movement or an institution like Park Synagogue or B'nai Jeshurun or whatever, right? That's not a critique. That's fine. I have no problem with what goes on at Park or at B'nai Jeshurun. I'm just not there because that's not how I see the conservative movement in the future and for me in the present. I now will shut up and listen to your comments, questions, and try to answer. I know that was a lot of stuff, and I hope that it was not too far afield. Not that it's complicated, you're a lot smarter than I am, but that it was not too far afield in trying to set the context for the discussion. Alan, you'll have to moderate this because if I start pressing buttons, I'm going to disappear somewhere, wherever.
Okay, yeah. So since most people have their, their screen off, if you wanted to ask a question or raise a comment, you could put your hand up at the bottom of the screen. It says, what does it say there? It says
raise hand.
Raise hand somewhere, but I don't see.
Under reactions.
Oh, under reactions. Okay. All right. So yeah. But while everyone's doing that, I wanted just to make a comment. What I got out of this is, I always say I have a strong Jewish identity. And what I got out of this is I realized that I have a strong conservative Jewish identity in that I won't eat shellfish and I won't eat a pork chop or a ham sandwich. But as you know, I'll have a pepperoni pizza. And I think that I'm a perfect conservative Jew. So, and I don't really believe in whatever the philosophy of kashrut is. I believe that it reminds me that I'm a Jew. That's the value of the tradition to me. And so I got a new understanding of that identity. So thank you for that. So I don't know what order the hands went up, but let's start with Linda Gross.
Hi.
Hello.
I have a lot of questions, but the one I'll ask is about a conservative conception of God. Is there a general sense that there is such a thing as a personal God who, one can pray to, I don't know, win your ball game, or to, who's paying attention to each of our lives, and who has a plan for each of us and all that kind of stuff?
So, Linda, that's a great question. And I sort of skirted the idea of theology because, in fact, within the conservative movement, as is true of all centrist movements, we're all over the board on that one. So conservative Judaism always believed, let's have the biggest tent possible, right? And include as many people under the tent as we could, for many reasons. Some of it was for good reasons of inclusion. Some of it had to do with, let's get more members because we can make more money or whatever, have larger synagogues. So the answer to your question is we're all over the board on this one. I would say that in its infancy, let's say going back 50 years, most conservative Jews believed in a personal God of some sort and believed that prayer was addressing that personal God. And of course, the classic is that, God can answer no. And that was part of sort of the conservative understanding of the world is that we pray to a personal God, and guess what? Sometimes the answer is no, so don't get upset, right? Or don't get too frustrated. I think over the last, say, 20 years, things have changed in the movement. Now, part of it is because that whole swath of people who didn't believe in a personal God, who agreed with Mordechai Kaplan, moved on to other movements, right? So some of that, sort of that edge, that side of it, many of those people who did not believe in a personal God, and of course, Mordechai Kaplan went even further than that, to his credit, and I don't want to over or understate his contribution to this, but I would say that at present, many conservative Jews, even in the knowledgeable rabbinic world, do not believe in a personal God per se. So the argument is we're not praying to God, we're sort of praying to ourselves to emphasize the ideals that are important to us. And then by extension, God is sort of inside of us. And again, under the influence of Mordechai Kaplan, hundreds and hundreds of rabbis embraced that idea. Armin Cohn, may he rest in peace, at Park Synagogue, embraced the ideas of Mordechai Kaplan, even if he didn't join the Reconstructionist movement per se. He certainly embraced those ideals, and many, many rabbis have. So the answer is there is no theological consistency to conservative Judaism. That is a strength and a weakness. And if you want to, argue that it is a weakness, I would agree. But it's a strength in that it opens up for inclusiveness on theological issues.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Bruce, you want to go next?
Sorry, did you say Bruce?
Yes.
Yes. The question I wanted to ask is would the leadership of the conservative movement, or of Park Synagogue for that matter, have the same view about the impending demise of the movement? And if not, if they're more optimistic about the future of the movement, then where would their disagreement with you lie?
Thank you. Good question. And I appreciate the fact that, that you've called me on the fact that, so I'm one person. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that every conservative Jew, and I suspect the new young rabbis coming out of the seminary are very optimistic. I hope they are. But so here's how I would answer you. I think that the leadership of the movement believes that if we can hold on to a very reduced form of tradition, and if we can move the idea of change further and further along, quicker and more judiciously, that the young people will see that conservative Judaism has merit, and it will survive on the strength of the return, if you will, of these young people. Let me give you a quick example of what I mean. And I'm not arguing right or wrong on this. The conservative movement has relatively recently published tshuvot, responsa, responsa on the inclusion of LGBTQ folks within Judaism. And they did it in a very judicious way because on the one hand, they understood that tradition didn't really go there. But if we're going to keep up with the modern world, then we need to go there. So tradition became less powerful on that issue and change happened. The problem is it happened so slowly that many of the younger people said, wait a minute, we've been there for decades. You guys are just getting there? Does that mean that tradition really holds us back from understanding the reality of the world in which we live? And the answer to that is that was a weakness of the movement. Now, to the extent that the movement can respond more quickly and more forcefully to the changes in American Judaism, perhaps there is an opportunity for a revitalization, if you will. But I have to tell you, at Park Synagogue, and I'll use Park Synagogue because I know some of the statistics, it's not news probably to anybody, but more than 50% of the bar and bat mitzvahs at Park Synagogue are interfaith families. And again, not that that's in itself a terrible thing, but I'm not sure you can build a strong movement on the backs of interfaith families, some of whom are very committed, a lot of whom are not. And will the movement be able to sustain itself? I just don't know when this older generation passes away and moves on. Where are the young people who are going to fill those synagogues? And if the movement is hoping that interfaith families will be the answer, I would say that's a foundation that's weak, to say the least. But your question is a good one. I hope that the younger generation of rabbis and teachers and leadership are more positive. I hope so. I hope they have a formula. I don't see it, but maybe they have a formula for revitalizing the movement. But from my perch, which is as a retired rabbi, and like all older people, I look back to the good old days, which weren't so good anyway. But so I understand that my bias also plays into this. I would have to be convinced by someone that there's a plan that will result in a revitalization of the movement. You should know that both from the numbers perspective of numbers of synagogues and numbers of members within the conservative movement, the last 20 years have been, as it was described to me, a hemorrhage of conservative Jews going elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. And Louise, you want to go next?
Yep. Just to put my comments in perspective, I grew up in a conservative synagogue, and during Joel and my 40 plus, almost 41 years of marriage, we spent 30 years in, I guess, 3 different conservative synagogues, a Reform synagogue for a little bit, and several minions and chavarot. So I have a lot of experience with the conservative movement. And my feeling has always been for the last number of years that there really aren't conservative Jews. That there are members of conservative synagogues, but the number or percentage of people in conservative synagogues who are really conservative Jews is really small. And people join conservative synagogues because, and maybe they join other synagogues because of this too, but they join conservative synagogues because their family members are members of that synagogue. They join conservative synagogues because their friends are members of that synagogue. They join conservative synagogues because they want that level of Hebrew education for their Jewish education for their kids. They join conservative synagogues because it's geographically close to them. And they join conservative synagogues because they like the rabbi or they like the congregants. And they don't join conservative synagogues because they believe in positive, what did you call it?
Positive historical Judaism.
Historical positive Judaism. They don't join conservative synagogues because they believe, in personal gods or whatever they believe. That has nothing to do with why they join synagogues. And a part of the decline in conservative synagogues is a decline in religious organizational affiliation everywhere, in churches and whatnot. And that's the whole, the whole welcoming movement and what's his name, Wolfson, kinds of stuff. And it seems to me that conservative movement synagogues are kind of stuck. They're stuck with 2 days of Yom Tov. They're stuck with Musaf. They're stuck with 3-hour services, sometimes longer. And people today don't want that. The same way that we don't listen to oratorios anymore that were 4 hours. And that happened in the Middle Ages or, 400 years ago. People would spend 4 hours listening to, going to an oratorio concert, so it's, and I would say about Bethel is that it's post-denominational. It's not, because it's not any denomination. So, but then again, who becomes the next rabbi? You've got a conservative rabbi now, but it just seems to me that maybe you're thinking like 50 years down the road, there isn't going to be a conservative movement. I don't know, it's, and also the whole due structure is very difficult because for young people, unless, the young people who are joining conservative synagogues now are more active, because if you're not active, then why would you join? Why would you spend, a couple $1,000s to join a synagogue as a young person when there's all other kinds of communities and whatever that you could be part of? So I don't know that that's a question, but just some comments.
No, I appreciate your perspective. And I will just point out to you, you proved my point. You're right that of the 1,400 families at Park Synagogue, whatever the number is, right? If there are 60 families that are real conservative Jews, that's what we're going to be in 25 years. A small group of people who are really committed. Forget the movement. I'm not even talking about a movement, but we could form, I could pick, I don't know the synagogue well anymore, I used to, but I could find 50 or 60 families, right? And structure something that would meet their needs, whether it's 3 hours or not 3 hours, whatever, and we could do that. That is not the model that the movement is based on, a model of let's build big, let's get a lot of people. And, by the way, your point about Jewish education, most conservative synagogues have given up on good Jewish education a long time ago. So for all of those reasons, I think that my understanding of the movement is, look at there's probably 600 conservative synagogues. In each synagogue, there may be a core of 40 or 50 families who are real conservative Jews. And those are going to be the people who will somehow survive, whether they call themselves, you're right, Bethel does not call themselves conservative Jews for all kinds of reasons. Rabbi Adler, may rest in peace, was an Orthodox rabbi, but I don't care what they call themselves. They are the kind of core of educated, interested, participatory Jews. And even within Bethel, of the 70 families, we're down to 40 who are real, committed Jews. But that's enough. For me, that's enough. It's not enough for a movement. And that's okay. I don't know if that's okay or not okay. I mean, I don't care. The survival of the movement, to me, but I'm old, so I'm not going to be around for much longer. But the survival of the movement is not the issue for me. The survival of Judaism and the idea of historical, positive understanding of tradition and change, that's what's important to me. And I honestly believe that that will survive because people like me are going to teach it to the next generation if we can.
So, I have an issue with the whole emphasis on survival of Judaism. So for me, it's important that I feel that Judaism has really enriched my life in many, 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 many ways, and I feel that I would like my children to experience that enrichment, and I sort of would like my grandchildren to experience some of that enrichment too. But whether Judaism exists 3,000 years from now, I don't really care.
Okay.
Or 500 years from now, or whatever.
I think we hear you. I appreciate, but there's other people who want to jump in. So thank you. I appreciate your comments, and I'm not minimizing it. You and I will disagree on that issue, but that's the way it is. Okay.
Okay, Judy, you want to go next?
Thank you. Yes, after looking, I feel a deep need to defend conservative Judaism, where I grew up, where one of my relatives just retired as a professor at JTS, and where I have a great deal of affection. However, I would not be comfortable in a conservative shul now. I am much more comfortable as a Reconstructionist Jew, mostly from an intellectual approach. But I just want to maybe not take issue with you, but bring up something. You seem to posit that in the conflict between tradition and change, tradition will always lose. And I'm trying to take some hope from the fact that certain traditions have actually become more popular, for lack of a better term, than they were 20 or 25 or 40 years ago. In particular, the one that's called, to let people know I am most attached to, is the Seder, which is so traditional and so infused with change, but has become so central to so many Jews' practice of Judaism and appreciation for Judaism. And you mentioned about the education. The movement still has good schools, the Schechter schools. There are, right now we're in DC, and there are a number of day schools here that are good, conservative. I don't know if the Mandel School here is a Schechter school, but they are basically not the Mandel School in Cleveland. There's one here in DC. That, you know, and they're not an Orthodox school. I don't know if they're affiliated with Schechter, but I think their basic approach is very much conservative. So, I mean, I'd like you to address those two things. I would feel it would be devastating if feeling that tradition always lost to change.
So thank you. I appreciate that. First of all, the Charles Smith Day School is one of the best in the country. Tradition doesn't always lose to change in the mind of the scholars, rabbis, teachers, and the core of Jews that we're talking about, who are real conservative Jews. But to the vast majority of our members in our large synagogues, the answer is yes. If tradition and change are up against each other, tradition loses. Now, if we could turn back that process so that people would be able to say, well, you know, not always does change win. Sometimes tradition needs to win. If we could honestly do that with large numbers of people, I think we could restructure the movement. Again, I just don't see it happening with a vast majority of conservative Jews. I think there's a core within, and for example, you're in DC, there's a synagogue in Rockville, Massachusetts, Rockville, Maryland, run by a colleague of mine, Lyle Fishman, who is a brilliant rabbi. And he has a core of people in his congregation who would argue with me and say, tradition always wins out over change, and change is slow and methodical, et cetera, right? But that's a small percentage. And I don't know that the movement can sustain itself as a movement with those small numbers. But the idea of balancing tradition and change, and not always giving into change over tradition, that idea, it exists in my mind. It exists in the mind of many people at Bethel, where I daven, even though they're not conservative Jews, they don't call themselves conservative Jews, but they would argue exactly the same thing. In the balance between tradition and change, sometimes tradition wins. Wins isn't the right word, but I know what you meant. Sometimes tradition is more important, and sometimes change is more important. And you're also correct. By the way, when I said education, I was thinking of Hebrew schools, synagogue schools, which have gone from 5 days a week to 3 days a week to 2 days a week to 1 day a week, and sometimes less than that. But one word about the Schechter schools, and this is something we need to deal with as if we're going to create a movement. Schechter schools are training children to be historically positive Jews, right? That is clear. The question is, where do they go after that? It's the same with Camp Ramah, which is the sort of camping wing of the movement. We train kids to think critically, to understand Jewish history and tradition, all of that stuff. And then they come home to their synagogue and they don't find it amongst the people, except that small core of people. They don't find it amongst the people. So they seek their religious life elsewhere, and they seek their spiritual life elsewhere because it just didn't make it in the conservative synagogue. Look, one of the things we could do to make conservative Judaism more palatable, I think, would be to, within our large synagogues, offer options for people. multiple options, right? Look, I'll give you an example. In my synagogue, which was in Sharon, Massachusetts, a group came to me and said, you know, the service that you run, we love you as a rabbi, but we don't like it so much. So can we have a Torah, and we'll go off into our own room and we'll run a service, right? It'll be led by lay people, not by rabbis and cantors, and it'll, you know, the whole thing. And I said, sure, absolutely. My members said to me, what are you doing? They'll destroy the synagogue. I said, no, they won't. They're committed to the synagogue, but they want a different experience. Fine, that makes sense. Let's do it. We did it. Synagogue didn't, you know, lightning didn't strike. The synagogue didn't disappear. It became stronger, not weaker. But again, we have to see ourselves in that kind of creative mode to be able to meet the needs of people of different ages, different socioeconomic situations, et cetera, and different religious, right? We can do that, and maybe that will be something that will save the movement if our large synagogues are willing to offer these kinds of options. I haven't seen too many synagogues that are willing to do that. So, you know, maybe I should be hopeful that the younger generation of rabbis will be more open to that. Maybe that will help.
Okay, so as we're getting closer to wrapping up, let's have one last question or comment from Linda and a short answer in return, and we'll be on time. So Linda, do you want to go again?
I do. When one of the questioners and the rabbi were talking about real conservative people, no, I mean, I know that I grew up in Park and we weren't very observant, so I would probably call myself not a real conservative Jew, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is what is the essence, other than this dialectic, you know, between tradition and change, what is the essence of a real conservative Jew?
But see, I think that is the essence of a conservative Jew, to embrace tradition and recognize that the tradition that we are embracing is an evolving process, and that tradition, because it was evolving, can continue to evolve going forward. The evolution may take time. It's not revolution, it's evolution. It may take time. It may not always be the way we think it should be at any given moment. But if we embrace tradition, if we embrace the ideas of Shabbat, Kashrut, and so forth, I mean, I want to get into all the details. If we embrace those ideas and understand that the process that we exhibit, that we follow today to observe Shabbat, has itself grown, changed, developed over time, and it can continue to develop, but it continues to develop within the construct of tradition. We're not going to observe Shabbat on Tuesday, even though in theory there's nothing wrong with that.
Got it.
There's nothing wrong. The bottom line is, even the Gemara says every 7 days. So if you start on Tuesday, the next 7 days is another Tuesday. But that's sort of the way the process has taken place. And the same with kashrut and prayer and all of the other structures within Judaism. We can embrace those. And let me give you one more caveat here. And I will end with this, and I see Rabbi Seeger wants to tell me that I've overstepped my bounds in many ways. For most conservative Jews, the areas of tradition that are most prone to change are areas that involve human relations, not ritual specifics. let me repeat that again, that the areas that are open for change are not I don't like kashrut. It's not convenient. Kosher meat costs too much money. Therefore, right, we change it, right? But areas that involve human behavior, relationships, etc. Issues such as LGBTQ and women in Judaism, etc. Human beings are involved there. And by the way, in kashrut, human beings can be involved as well. Ethical kashrut needs to be something that we embrace. I agree 100% with that. I was involved with that when I was part of the movement. So even ritual matters can have impact on human behavior. But embracing traditional norms of sort of ritual understandings, while at the same time realizing that we can't live in the 14th century or 800 before the Common Era. We live in 2022, and human beings have evolved and changed and should evolve and change. Those are the challenges of conservative Judaism. We can do it. It's just that large numbers of Jews may not do it. But those that do it can teach that to their children and grandchildren, and maybe start a kind of rolling change that will take place within the Jewish world.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I just want to add 2 cents is that
Rabbi has his hand up.
oh, I didn't see that. Oh, you do. Okay, so
Alan, if you wanna go, I did have a quick
go.
question and comment.
Go. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to express collegially my appreciation for you, Reb Barry, being here this evening and sharing your experience and your insight into the conservative movement with our community. And
Thank you.
so thank you very much for doing that. I do want to respectfully, I don't know if disagree or just kind of put a counterpoint out to one thing that I heard, which had to do with what I heard that you referred to Park Synagogue's ability to their continuity being weakened because of the significant number of interfaith families. And I just would like to say that I personally, I don't believe that there is actually any correlation that I have, and no data that I've seen that shows that endogamous Jewish couples are necessarily more likely to, I mean, that's one of the reasons why our rabbinical school opened itself up to welcoming rabbinical students who are married to non-Jewish partners. So I just want to say that's just that's a pretty, I think that's, and I think the movements will, the Reconstruction movement, the conservative movement would very much differ on that particular question. And lastly, I just wanted to, I was curious about, it seems to me that a lot of the conversation this evening has kind of revolved around to what extent is the philosophy of conservative Judaism taking root or not taking root amongst, members of conservative communities. I wonder if to me, the big issue has to do with authority and who has the right to make decisions for individual Jews in the Jewish community. And I missed the beginning of your talk, so you may have dealt with this then, and I apologize, but it seems to me that part of every movement has its own challenges and opportunities. And so I'm going to be in the hot seat next week. So I'm going to have to do this for Reconstructionism. But it seems like one of the biggest challenges for the conservative movement is the claim that, and the desire for the rabbinic leadership to have a certain authority over the laity that in practice doesn't actually exist for most members of conservative congregations. And it's, I don't know how long, I don't know if you think there's been an evolution in that erosion of authority vis-a-vis the rabbis to the laity. But I wonder if there were, how many conservative Jews were driving on Shabbat before the Rabbinical Assembly made the official declaration that it was okay to drive their car to shul. I mean, I imagine that there are already lots of conservative Jews. I don't know. I'm just
Absolutely.
Anyway. That's I just wanted to see if you.
So just the second point first. I mean, the first point, I understand what you're saying, and I have anecdotal but not statistical understanding of where interfaith families fit into this. So you're right. I mean, I don't know what the future will be. And I did, as I said, there are many interfaith families that are more committed to Judaism than endogamous families, no question about that. And then there are a lot who are not, and where that will come out in the end, I don't know, and what it'll mean. The issue of authority, that small core that I'm talking about in every conservative synagogue does maintain the idea they have granted authority. I mean, we're in a democracy, so you have to grant authority in a sense, right? That you can't take it, you get it granted to you, and they would accept rabbinic authority. 90% of the conservative Jews join those synagogues and have not really granted that authority to the rabbi. They may like the rabbi, they may listen to the rabbi because he's wise, or she is wise and has something to say, but have not granted authority to their lives, in their lives to the rabbi. And so that's another way in which it's that small core of people. In theory, conservative Judaism is based on the authority of rabbinic interpretation to guide the future of the Jewish movement, of the Jewish people, right? That small core of people accepts that authority. Most conservative Jews do not. And again, that's how I get to this idea of the small core, because we can count them on two hands, or maybe one hand, of the people who accept that rabbinic authority. Most conservative Jews, I mean, they will accept it, but they don't really, they'll accept whatever the rabbi says in the synagogue, about the service. Oh, well, you can do Musaf this way or that way, whatever. But they don't really think about it. It's not like, it's just, I don't want to make this decision, you make the decision for me. But they're not really giving over to rabbinic authority the Judaism in their lives. Agreed 100%. And of course, that's where our movements differ in this major issue of authority, and probably where you differ from Reform as well. But I don't know that that's the case in reality, even if it may be the case in theory. But that's where we're at. But thank you for sharing, and thank you for sharing your congregation, pieces of it, with me. It's always fun, and I always enjoy good questions and good responses to what we're doing. So good luck next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. It was very thought-provoking, and I learned things about the movement that I grew up in that I ought to have learned back when, I wish I had. It gives me a greater appreciation for some of the elements. So thanks for kicking us off. Good start. And so everyone, just to remind you that next Wednesday, we'll have Rabbi Steve talking about our movement. So thank you, and we'll see you all then.
Thank you.
And good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
You're welcome.